Good afternoon. One of the best weekends of finals, I think, in the history of the game. The upshot, of course, of which is that Geelong and Sydney are through to the prelim finals, just one game away from the grand final. Geelong, of course, at home on the Friday night at the MCG, most likely. Sydney, most likely on the Saturday night, given Geelong finished on top. And this weekend, it is sudden death and on for Fremantle and Collingwood, and, of course, Melbourne and Brisbane. So much to discuss from the weekend. It was absolutely incredible. I'll start with Melbourne this afternoon, and in particular, Christian Petracca. Now, Petracca has trained with Melbourne today, albeit obviously on light duties. He's got a bad corky of the calf and a hairline fracture of his fibula, which is one of the two legs in your lower leg. I spoke to a leading sports doctor last night. They said if Petracca plays, he'll be in significant pain. Petracca manages some soccer and light work at training this morning, I should explain. If he plays, he'll be in significant pain because a fracture is a fracture, despite the fact that it's a hairline fracture. These are usually 2 or 3 weeks minimum. Scott Pendlebury spoke on Marty's show this morning, Marty Sheargold's show, and explained that he'd had a similar injury before and said obviously it's a risk versus reward proposition, particularly given Petracca's on a 7-year deal for Melbourne. It's going to be a huge, huge consideration for them this week. Of course, if they shut down Neil, maybe they could rest Petracca and put, say, Harms onto Neil, and they might win anyway and get him right for the prelim or the grand final, but a massive, massive talking point this week. Of course, there's huge emphasis also on Tom McDonald, who was sore from the VFL. What needs another VFL game, he told me, pre-game Friday night, so he's not necessarily available for selection, but would be helpful in terms of their connection into the forward line. Spargo spent the night in hospital over the weekend with a knock to his throat, should be fine. Melksham and Fritsch have knee concerns. Oliver copped that whack to the cheek. He's relatively okay from a structural perspective, but of course will be sore this week. Melbourne, it's incredible. You'd have to say they're sort of up against it against Brisbane, who can score heavily. But having said that, they'll have to go through the Geelong route now as well. So an interesting situation as far as Melbourne's concerned ahead of this week. I've been in at the AFL this morning. I'll give you a brief synopsis on what's going on there. Gil McLachlan close to announcing a landmark record TV deal. But what the AFL did at the last minute was invite all the participants into AFL House this morning, 9, 10, and then the AFL went and visited Channel 7 to get their final pitches and amounts they want to bid for the TV rights, almost like a little auction this morning. I'll have details on that tonight. I expect an outcome later in the week. Of course, Gil McLachlan sat very publicly with Kerry Stokes, the chairman of 7 West Media, on Saturday night over in the West. You'd think 7 and Fox are in the box seat for the rights, but 9 and 10 were both in pitching to the AFL this morning. There's a lot going on at Richmond. I'll whip through it. In summary, Trent Cotchin, I understand, has agreed to an extension. I expect that'll be 1 year. They haven't announced it yet, but I think they will in coming days. Jack Riewoldt, like Cotchin, has an offer in place that will be on less money. The reason is because Tim Taranto will go to Richmond on up to a 7-year deal. Now, I can also reveal on this podcast today that whilst the prevailing view is that Hopper is locked into Geelong, and I think you can take that almost as given, it's still a big choice for Hopper because Richmond remain in the race for Jacob Hopper. He still has to make that decision, the Giant. It's most likely Geelong, but Richmond's still in the race. And again, if Hopper chose Richmond, clearly they'd have to clear more salary space. So Cotchin, I believe, has agreed to an extension. Riewoldt hasn't agreed yet, is expected to, but faces a significant pay cut, $300,000 a year is the figure that Mark Robinson's referred to in the Herald Sun today. And the Dustin Martin situation is that Dusty's been in for his exit interview this morning at Punt Road, hasn't commented, obviously, in regards to the Dancer situation, which I'll get to lately, and also his future. Rarely comments. There's no surprise there. But he had his exit interview this morning, Dustin Martin. If I had to summarise that situation, clearly he's had limited passion at times for the game this year. Clearly he's been affected by his dad's death. But I also know through close contact with Ralph Carr, who I sat with, his manager at the football last Thursday night, that Dusty has a lot of good investments in some great commercial properties, I think in and around Richmond and Collingwood. He's got 2 years to run on his contract with up to $2.5 million. And obviously a lot of that income, no doubt, would go into servicing those properties, which I'm sure will prove to be good investments in the future. So there's part of this that's commercial. Dusty needs to keep playing and obviously get Richmond's money in. So that's the latest situation in regards to Dustin Martin. Collingwood's due to have a light run at about 3:30 this afternoon. One talking point, Craig McRae's comments post-game on some of the players sitting down on the ground. This is what Craig had to say.
Well, we want to act like winners. I must admit, the siren goes and there's half a dozen of our guys laying on the ground. For me, that's not a winner. That's acting like a loser. We lost the game. We're not losers. So I just made that point. We're here to win this thing. We'll give it everything we've got. You get to this time of the year and you want to give it your best shot. And I thought we threw a lot of punches at them.
Straight off the
Absolutely. We lost the game, but we're not losers. There is a difference. I said that for the lifetime that I'm sitting in this chair that maybe barring a grand final, if we don't win, don't lay on the ground.
It's worth keeping in mind that Craig cut his teeth and learned a lot under Lee Matthews. That's Lee Matthews 101, that sort of stuff. Craig clearly wants to reset the narrative. There's a lot of positives for Collingwood supporters. Clearly, they pushed the minor premiers to within one kick, and clearly he wants them to be up and about and crack into Fremantle and beat Fremantle this week, Craig McRae. Scott Pendlebury addressed that issue on Marty's show this morning and had this to say, offering, well, similar comments.
Yeah, I was the same out there. I was next to Steel Sidebottom and said to him, like, let's pick these boys up quick. Like, I didn't like the look of it either. Like, yeah, we had lost, but we weren't losers. I thought we should
defeated.
Yeah, and as a team, what we're trying to stand for and what we're trying to build, I didn't like the look of it, but we got everyone up quickly and let's stay together. I think all year we've done that really well. Win or lose, when you see us, we're tight and we stay together.
You walked off as a team.
And we walked off tired and, we'll be back to fight another day for sure.
Just the latest on Collingwood's injuries. Adams clearly is the season with that groin, ripped off the bone. He's had a scan late this morning, but I expect that'll formally confirm that. Craig McRae commented on that post-game. Ash Johnson was sore, but I think it's right to go. Jordan De Goey has a sore AC joint in his shoulder. He spoke to some good contacts of mine yesterday and indicated that it should be relatively okay. So obviously he'll be a big talking point this week as well. Lots of moments for the Pies. Dacos pushed his kick wide. Cripps missed. Darcy Moore was forward on the goal line. Rowan took that pack mark. Hawkins and Cameron were incredible in that contest because they drew a lot of the defenders, including Moore, to the back of the pack. So that helped Rowan in the end. Adams obviously got injured. De Goey nailed his goal, but Hoskin Elliott had that set shot early in the last quarter as well. There were lots of discussion points from what I thought was one of the best finals I've ever seen.
Bringing you the latest in footy news before you hear it anywhere else. This is Tom Browne's News.
There's lots of trade discussion heating up, obviously, in the background, particularly for the 10 clubs outside the 8, but also for the clubs inside the 8. North is getting aggressive on chasing players, namely because now they've got a seat at the table in the form of Alistair Clarkson. Because of Clarko, they can get meetings with pretty much, any available player they want. So I know that Tanner Bruhn was offered an attractive offer from North Melbourne. He's opted not to go there, but they've become somewhat of a destination club, North Melbourne, overnight in essence. And Darcy Tucker, I think they could land. The Docker is down to 2 clubs, Essendon and North Melbourne in pole position for Darcy Tucker. Robbie Fox played well on Friday night for the Swans. He's about to sign a 2-year extension with Sydney. His pressure got 17 or 18 odd possessions. He was magnificent for the Swans. Geez, they look good. They're going to be awfully hard to beat up at the SCG. Collingwood face that, but can't afford to worry about that at the moment. Obviously, Fremantle first. From Carlton, it's my understanding that Dow, Setterfield and Stocker are effectively on the market and available for the right offer. Now, I know that applies to all players, but Dow, Setterfield and Stocker have come up on my trade radar this morning. Dow played 4 games this year. 2 of them were as the unused medical sub. Setterfield 13 games and Stocker 6 games. So keep an eye on that. The score review, we still haven't got a clear explanation on that really from the AFL. I know in the background there is better technology available. I think it's even in place at the MCG, but not all venues yet. But the AFL want to get that perfect before they change the existing score review technology. I think there's some work from even Google in that space, I've heard along the grapevine, that would be revolutionary. So I know there's different offerings in the background. I think in the future, 4 or 5 years' time, that won't be an offer. We'll have an issue. We'll have something much similar to Hawkeye in obviously tennis and indeed cricket. The technology's there, but they're working on it. So there's a lot going on in the background in that regard. We also haven't got an answer yet or a position from Richmond on Dustin Martin and the investigation into his into the dancer at the club function in 2015. That was at the Sporting Globe in Richmond, which is a pub. It was booked out for a private function. It wasn't the pub's knowledge or issue. It's Richmond and the players. I know the AFL's working through that investigation. And just in terms, this is an interesting one. I got a text message this morning. These are the AFL rules in regards to a draw. Had there been a draw, and 2 of the games clearly over the weekend could have been draws, Thursday night and Saturday twilight, the Brisbane-Richmond game and the Collingwood-Geelong game. And there's 2 periods of 3 minutes plus time on each end. So that's what would have happened on Saturday night. So it's not 2 5 minutes, it's 2 3 minutes. The AFL's put out clarification in recent months in that regard, but it just slipped slightly below the radar. It's going to be an absolutely massive week of news. We'll bring it all to you, of course, on our social channels as and when it happens. There's trade happening. There's huge injuries, huge injury news, particularly, obviously, the emphasis this week on Goey and, of course, Petracca. Massive, massive game. Sudden death for Melbourne and Collingwood. It was a magnificent weekend of football, not to mention, of course, the Bulldogs. Dunkley likely, you'd think, on a long-term deal to go to Port Adelaide. They've now leaked the best part of 17 goals in 2 consecutive finals in streak. So you've got to ask yourself why that happens. I know Luke Beveridge was keen to downplay the significance of that post-game. He's got to do that. But as Damien Barrett pointed out on the Footy Show yesterday, it's a trend based on 2 finals. You can't ignore it. It was a huge talking point. Triple M rocks football.